"You're making a mistake." Sienna Carter's voice was sharp, trembling between fury and heartbreak. She stood in the middle of Ethan Lancaster's penthouse, her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt like this conversation was nothing more than a formality. "I'm making a choice, Sienna, a logical one." The words hit like a slap. Logical? She had spent years by his side, loving him, believing in him, standing by him through late nights, impossible deadlines, and the relentless hunger he had for success. And now he was treating their relationship like a bad business investment. "So that's it," she scoffed, blinking away the sting in her eyes. "You just decided I don't fit into your perfect world anymore?" Ethan met her gaze, that same piercing, blue stare that used to make her knees weak, now cold and detached. "I've worked too hard to build my future, Sienna, and that future requires a different kind of woman by my side." Her stomach twisted, nausea creeping up her throat. "A different kind of woman." The meaning was clear. Someone polished, someone with the right name, the right connections, someone who fit into the glossy, elite world he was chasing. "And let me guess," she bit out, stepping closer, invading his space, forcing him to see what he was throwing away. "You've already found her." He didn't confirm it, he didn't have to. Something inside her snapped. "You arrogant son of a bitch," she hissed. Before she could think better of it, her hand was on his chest, shoving him back a step. "You don't get to act like this is some strategic decision, like this is just another move on your damn chessboard." Ethan's jaw tensed, but he didn't push her away. Instead, his hand shot out, catching her wrist, pulling her flush against him. The air crackled. For one agonizing moment, she felt it again, the undeniable, raw connection between them. His scent, a mix of cedarwood and whiskey, overwhelmed her senses. The warmth of his breath ghosted over her lips. His grip tightened, not rough, but firm enough to make her pulse spike. His eyes darkened, flickering to her mouth. God, he wanted her. Even now, her body betrayed her, heat pooling low in her stomach, breath hitching at the familiar weight of his hands on her skin. But it was too late for that. She wasn't about to let her body override her dignity. She tore herself free, her heart pounding in her throat. "You will regret this," she whispered, voice low, laced with the kind of certainty only a woman scorned could possess. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't think I will." The final blow. Sienna swallowed the lump rising in her throat, forcing steel into her spine. Without another word, she turned on her heel, grabbed her bag, and walked out of his penthouse for the last time. She never looked back. Ethan Lancaster leaned back in his leather chair, fingers lightly tapping against the rim of his crystal tumbler. The amber liquid inside barely moved, but his mind was anything but still. It had been years since Sienna Carter walked out of his life, but for some damn reason, the memory of her still surfaced at the most inconvenient times. Like now, the boardroom was filled with men in expensive suits, voices droning on about market expansion and architectural bids. Ethan should have been focused, hell, he always was, but as he sat at the head of the table, something gnawed at him, a shift in the air, then a single sentence snapped his attention back into razor-sharp clarity. "And, as of this morning, Lancaster Designs has been officially acquired." Silence. Ethan's grip on his glass tightened, his jaw ticked. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but everyone in the room felt the crackle of something volatile beneath it. One of the senior partners adjusted his tie. "There was a buyout. Quiet. Efficient. We didn't think it would go through, but the offer was difficult to refuse." Ethan's blood ran cold. His company, his empire, his name. "Who?" he demanded. A pause. Then the answer that shattered everything. "Sienna Carter." The words hit like a punch to the ribs. Ethan didn't react at first. He simply stared at the man who said it, waiting for him to correct himself, waiting for this to be a mistake. It wasn't. The laughter that left his lips was low, dark, laced with disbelief. Sienna. The woman he once discarded like an afterthought had just taken his entire company out from under him. An odd sensation spread through his chest, half fury, half something far more dangerous. Intrigue. A slow smirk tugged at his lips. So, she wanted to play? Fine, let the games begin. Ethan Lancaster didn't bother knocking. His stride was controlled, powerful, every step measured with precision as he pushed open the glass doors of what had once been his office. Except now, she sat in his chair. Sienna Carter. The woman he once thought he had outgrown. The woman he had tossed aside like a chapter he had finished reading. And yet, here she was. She didn't even flinch when he entered, didn't look up right away. She sat there, elegantly composed, one leg crossed over the other, reviewing a document like he wasn't standing in front of her, practically vibrating with tension. Ethan exhaled through his nose, forcing his pulse to steady. Enjoying my chair? That got her attention. Sienna finally glanced up, and damn it all, she was even more breathtaking than he remembered. Time had sharpened her beauty, her cheekbones more defined, her confidence now a tangible force. She wasn't just the ambitious designer he once knew. She was a CEO. His CEO. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips as she leaned back in the chair, his chair, and tilted her head. You mean my chair, Lancaster? His jaw tightened. He should have been furious, and he was. But beneath the simmering anger was something else, something darker, something like fascination. Sienna stood, stepping around the massive desk until she was in front of him. Too close, close enough that he caught the faint scent of vanilla and something else, something distinctly her. God help him, he still remembered the way she smelled. You don't seem surprised, she observed, eyes flickering over him, assessing, playing with him. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, low and lethal. Oh, I'm surprised, sweetheart, but not about you taking the company. No, that part makes sense. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur. I just didn't think you'd come back for me this soon. Her lips parted for a fraction of a second. A hesitation, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Ethan wasn't most people. Sienna recovered quickly, her smile sharpening like a blade. You overestimate your importance, Lancaster. She stepped past him, the faintest brush of her body against his as she moved toward the window. This wasn't about you. Liar. He could hear it in the way she exhaled a little too carefully, in the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, like she was forcing herself to stay composed. He turned to face her, tilting his head, studying her like he was analyzing the blueprints of a structure no one else could understand. If this wasn't about me, then tell me, why Lancaster Designs? Out of all the firms in the world, why this one? Sienna glanced at him over her shoulder, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Because I could. The words sent a hot rush through his veins. Oh, this was going to be fun, you know, Ethan mused, stepping closer until he could feel the warmth radiating off her skin. If you wanted my attention, Sienna, you could have just called. I would have picked up. She let out a quiet laugh, and damn it, the sound did things to him, made his blood hum. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, throwing his own endearment back at him. Then she turned fully, lifting her chin, her confidence. Intoxicating. I didn't come back for your attention. I came back to take everything. Ethan's smirk widened. Let's see who takes who first. Ethan Lancaster wasn't a man who liked losing, especially not to a woman who used to belong to him. He sat across from Sienna Carter in the sleek, glass-walled conference room, watching, as she ran a delicate finger along the rim of her coffee cup. She hadn't even spared him a glance since she walked in. Power move. Fine. Two could play. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stretching out, letting his presence fill the room. So tell me, Sienna, how does it feel to finally sit at the top? His voice was smooth, edged with challenge. Sienna's lips curled into something dangerously amused. Wouldn't you like to know? Ethan exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. This woman. It had been years, but she still knew exactly how to dig under his skin. You've been making a lot of changes, he continued, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. I saw the restructuring proposal, aggressive moves. You sure you can handle the pressure? Finally, she looked at him. And damn it, the intensity in those dark eyes made something coil tight in his gut. Sienna tilted her head. That almost sounded like concern, Lancaster. She tapped a manicured nail against the table. Or is it doubt? Ethan smirked. Neither. Just curiosity. I know how relentless this industry can be. It takes a certain kind of endurance. A slow, almost imperceptible lift of her brow. Good thing I have plenty of that. The tension thickened, shifting into something deeper. Ethan watched as she crossed one leg over the other, her dress riding up just enough to test his restraint. He knew she did it on purpose, knew she was playing with him, and damn it, it was working. Endurance, huh? Ethan mused, voice dropping just a fraction. Funny. I remember testing that quite a few times. The moment stretched between them, electric and unspoken. Sienna didn't flinch. You think too highly of yourself, Lancaster. But there was the slightest catch in her breath, and he caught it. She still felt this. She might have taken his company, but she hadn't taken this from him. Heat flickered between them, tangible, alive. Ethan leaned in just enough to make it intimate, his voice dropping lower. Let's be honest, sweetheart. You didn't come back just for Lancaster designs. Sienna didn't move, didn't blink, but he could see it. The momentary slip. A flicker of something beneath that polished exterior. Then, just as fast, she shut. Tie it down. She stood smoothly, adjusting the lapel of her blazer, her expression composed. I have another meeting to attend. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. Running already. A small smile touched her lips. No, Lancaster. I just have priorities. She walked away, leaving only the faintest trace of vanilla and something undeniably, Sienna lingering in the air. Ethan sat there for a moment, watching her disappear through the glass doors, his pulse still thrumming. This game? It had just begun. Ethan Lancaster had played this game before. Power, seduction, control, but never against her. Not like this. The private dinner had been arranged under the pretense of discussing company strategy, but they both knew better. This wasn't about business. This was about who would break first. Sienna Carter walked into the dimly lit restaurant with purpose, every step deliberate, every movement calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. Ethan watched from their secluded table, swirling the whiskey in his glass. The second she stepped into view, the world around him blurred. The dress, blood red, satin, fitted to perfection. It clung to her like a second skin, accentuating curves he remembered too well. She sat across from him, unbothered, effortless. I assume you ordered for me, Ethan smirked. Of course, old habits. A single brow lifted. Dangerous words, Lancaster. Sounds like you're reminiscing. The tension pulsed between them. The waiter arrived, setting down a plate of seared scallops and a glass of red wine in front of her. She traced the rim of the glass, eyes flicking up to meet his. I suppose you still think you know what I like. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice a velvet rasp. I remember everything, Sienna. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of wine, letting the silence stretch. Funny, she finally murmured, placing the glass down. I thought you had a habit of forgetting things. Or people. A direct hit. Ethan inhaled deeply, a smirk ghosting his lips. You're still holding on to that? Sienna tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Onto what? She wanted him to say it, admit it. Instead, Ethan reached for his own glass, letting the moment simmer. The past, sweetheart. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. But if you want to talk about that night, we can. Sienna's fingers tightened around her fork, a reaction Ethan noticed. Of course he did. Which night? She asked smoothly. But the way she shifted slightly in her seat told him she knew exactly which one he meant. Ethan's lips curved. The one where you swore you'd never come back to me. Sienna exhaled softly, but her composure didn't crack. I didn't come back to you, Ethan. I came back for what was mine. Their gazes locked. The air between them was thick with something untamed, something neither of them wanted to name. Ethan placed his glass down, watching her too closely. And yet here we are. Dinner, candlelight, expensive wine. Almost feels like a date. Sienna let out a quiet, dangerously alluring laugh. If that's what you need to tell yourself, She picked up her fork, taking a slow, deliberate bite of her food. Ethan tracked every movement, the way her lips parted, the way her throat moved as she swallowed. It was infuriatingly erotic. He leaned in again, voice edged with something darker now. "You can pretend all you want, Sienna, but this game, it only ends one way." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "Yes," she murmured, eyes glinting with undeniable challenge. "And it won't be with you winning." Ethan felt it then, the sharp, unmistakable pull. The way his body responded to hers, the way she ignited something deep, primal, uncontrollable. She wasn't just playing, she was winning. For now. Sienna Carter wasn't sure which part of the night had been more infuriating, Ethan's smug arrogance over dinner, or the fact that she couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes darkened every time she pushed him. She had walked out of that restaurant feeling victorious, leaving him to stew in the tension he had helped create. But fate, it seemed, had other plans, because now she was trapped in an elevator, with him. The moment the doors slid shut behind them, a low mechanical hum filled the air, then an abrupt clunk. The lights flickered, and everything stopped. Sienna's stomach tightened. "You've got to be kidding me." Beside her, Ethan exhaled a short laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Well, sweetheart, looks like you're stuck with me." Tension crackled instantly. The enclosed space, the heat of his body, too close, too familiar. The scent of whiskey and cedarwood laced with something purely Ethan. Sienna took a slow breath, keeping her face impassive. "Trust me, Lancaster, this is a nightmare for both of us." Ethan smirked. "Is it?" The way he said it, low, intimate, like he knew exactly what was flashing through her mind. Her jaw tightened. "Don't flatter yourself." Ethan leaned back against the wall, hands in his pockets, looking completely unbothered. "You know, Sienna, for someone who claims to be over me, you sure spend a lot of time acting like you're not." Her pulse spiked. The sheer nerve of this man. She turned, ready to shut him down, but that was her mistake, facing him, because now she was really looking at him, the way his shirt was still slightly unbuttoned at the collar from dinner. The strong line of his jaw dusted with the shadow of a day's worth of stubble. The heat in his gaze, slow and deliberate, tracing her like a man who knew exactly how to unravel her. "Damn it." Sienna crossed her arms. "I was delusional." Ethan stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough that she felt him. "You sure about that?" he murmured. A rush of heat spread over her skin. She hated how her body reacted, how the air between them thickened with something unmistakable. Sienna held her ground. "I don't play games, Ethan." He let out a quiet chuckle. "Sweetheart, you've been playing with me since the second you walked into my office. The question is, when are you going to admit that you like it?" The space was too small, the tension unbearable, a slow breath, a single beat of silence. Then it snapped. Before she could think better of it, her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him down as her mouth crashed against his. The kiss was nothing but fire, teeth, tongues, desperation. Ethan groaned, deep and low, as his hands found her hips, pulling her flush against him. The elevator walls pressed against her back as he deepened the kiss, his hand sliding up the curve of her waist, his thumb teasing the edge of fabric that separated her from his touch. Heat coiled low in her stomach. It was too much, too good, too dangerous. This was what he did, and she had just let him win. Sienna tore herself away, breathless, pulse pounding. "Damn it," she whispered, pressing her fingers to her lips. Ethan stood there, chest rising and falling, gaze locked onto her like she was his next conquest. Then, just like that, the elevator lurched back to life, a cruel twist of fate. The doors slid open, and before he could say another word, Sienna walked out without looking back. Ethan smirked, running a hand through his hair. Oh, sweetheart. Now it was just a matter of time. Sienna Carter wasn't thinking straight. She told herself 1,000 times that it had been a mistake. The elevator, the kiss, the way Ethan's hands had burned against her skin like he had the right to touch her. But when she stepped into the gala that night, she felt him before she even saw him. A slow thrum of awareness coiled through her. Low and dangerous, Ethan Lancaster stood across the ballroom, a whiskey in hand, dressed in a black tux that fit like sin. His sharp blue eyes locked onto hers instantly, like he had been waiting. Sienna ignored the heat prickling at her skin. She wouldn't let him get to her. Not again. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to focus on anything but the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing in the damn room. It didn't matter, because within moments, he was in front of her. Care to dance, sweetheart? His voice was silk and temptation. She should have said no. She should have walked away. Instead, she placed her hand in his. The second he pulled her into his arms, the world disappeared. His hand pressed firmly against her lower back, pulling her flush against him. Too close, too familiar. She sucked, in a breath, tilting her head to look at him. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Ethan smirked, his thumb moving in slow, torturous circles against her spine. "You tell me." Heat pulsed through her, pooling deep in her stomach. The music swelled around them, a slow, sensual rhythm. Their bodies moved in sync, every step a deliberate tease. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lancaster," she murmured. Ethan leaned, in, his lips barely grazing the shell of her ear. "And yet you keep letting me win." A shiver ran down her spine. Then suddenly she needed air. Sienna pulled back, breaking free from his hold. Without a word, she turned on her heel and left the ballroom, pushing past the heavy doors and stepping into the cool night air of the balcony. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. What the hell was she doing? Why did he still get to her like this? A deep voice cut through the silence behind her. "Running again?" Her body went rigid. "Ethan." She didn't turn around. "I needed fresh air." She heard the click of his shoes against the marble as he stepped closer. "Liar!" Her pulse jumped when he reached her, his body just inches from hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint mix of whiskey and cedarwood that had always driven her insane. Sienna clenched her jaw. "You don't get to do this, Ethan." He reached for her then, his fingers brushing down her bare arm, sending a violent shudder of awareness through her. "Do what?" "Make you remember." Her breath hitched. Damn him, because he was right. She remembered everything, every touch, every whispered moan, every night spent tangled in his sheets, his body driving her to the edge over and over again. And when he turned her to face him, when his hands gripped her waist and pulled her flush against his hard, unforgiving body, she let him. The tension snapped. His lips crashed against hers, raw and consuming. The taste of him, whiskey and something darkly addictive, invaded her senses. She gasped into his mouth as he pressed her against the balcony railing, his hands exploring, rediscovering, claiming. She should stop this, she didn't. Because tonight she didn't want to fight. Tonight she just wanted him. Sienna Carter stirred, the warmth of another body against hers pulling her from the depths of sleep. The scent of whiskey, cedarwood and sex still lingered on the sheets. Her eyes flickered open, and for a split second she allowed herself to breathe in the moment. The slow rise and fall of Ethan's chest beside her, the way the early morning light traced the lines of his perfectly sculpted body. He was asleep, peaceful, unaware, and she needed to get out. Panic licked up her spine. The memories from last night came rushing back, the way he had pushed her against the balcony, devouring her like a starving man. The way they had barely made it through. His penthouse door before clothes were torn away in a frenzy of desperate hands and fevered kisses. The way he had held her down, whispered her name like a prayer, and pulled her over the edge again and again. And the worst part, she had wanted it. She had needed it. But now, reality crashed down. This wasn't just some stranger. This was Ethan Lancaster, the same man who had shattered her heart, who had once treated her like an afterthought, and she had let him back in. Sienna sucked in a sharp breath and forced herself to move. Carefully, she untangled herself from his grip, sliding out of bed. The cool air prickled against her bare, sensitized skin as she reached for her dress, slipping it on with trembling fingers. She needed to leave before he woke up, before he saw how much this had messed with her head. But just as she reached for her heels, running again. Her entire body froze. She turned slowly, her stomach twisting. Ethan was awake and watching her. His deep blue eyes, still heavy with sleep, darkened as they raked over her half-dressed form, hair wild, lips swollen, the evidence of last night still painted all over her. His expression smug, like he already knew what she was going to do. Sienna's jaw clenched. "I have a meeting." Ethan sat up, resting his forearm on his knee, the sheets barely covering his hips. "Bullshit." His voice was rough, morning graveled, dangerous. "Damn him. Believe what you want." She forced herself to grab her clutch, forcing her pulse to steady. Ethan moved fast. In one fluid motion, he was out of bed, bare-chested, heat radiating from his infuriatingly perfect body. He caught her, wrist before she could step away, his grip firm but not unkind. "Tell me you regret it," he murmured, his voice low, his thumb brushing circles against her skin. "And I'll let you go." Sienna hated that her body reacted to him, hated that she could still feel every place he had touched her. Her lips parted. She should say it. She should walk away. Instead, "I can't do this again, Ethan." For the first time, his smirk faltered, but she didn't let him speak. Before he could, she pulled her wrist free and walked out of his penthouse, leaving behind only the scent of her perfume on his skin. Ethan exhaled a slow, dark chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "Oh, sweetheart," he muttered, shaking his head. This wasn't over. Sienna Carter had spent the entire morning trying to forget. She had thrown herself into work, into meetings, into anything that would drown out the ghost of Ethan Lancaster's hands on her body. But it wasn't working, because every move she made, she still felt him. The way his fingers had traced, down her spine, the rough scrape of his stubble against the sensitive skin of her neck, the way he had groaned her name into the dark, like he was starving for her. And now she was standing in the middle of her office, gripping the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles ached, pretending she wasn't falling apart. Then, a knock, sharp, deliberate. She already knew who it was. Damn him. She exhaled slowly, pulling herself together before calling out, "Come in." The second Ethan stepped through the door, the air changed. The tension was instant, a live wire snapping between them. He closed the door behind him with calculated slowness, his gaze locked onto her like he could already see through the walls she had thrown up. He didn't speak at first, just watched. That smirk, that maddening, arrogant smirk, was nowhere to be found. "Running off this morning was a bad move, Sienna." His voice was low, gravel-edged, pure sin. Her breath hitched, but she refused to let him see it. She lifted a brow, keeping her expression neutral. "I don't recall needing your approval." The challenge was set. Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance just enough for her to feel the heat of him. His fingers ghosted along the edge of her desk, deliberate, teasing. "You think you can just pretend it didn't happen?" His voice was softer now, but lethal. "That you didn't shatter in my arms last night?" Sienna's pulse spiked. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "Tell me," he murmured, voice a slow, intoxicating drawl. "Do you still feel me?" A shiver licked down her spine. She clenched her jaw. "Get out, Lancaster." Ethan didn't move. Instead, he reached out. A single fingertip traced the inside of her wrist, barely touching, just enough to send fire rushing through her veins. Sienna hated how her breath caught. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His smirk returned, slow and predatory. "That's what I thought." Before she could react, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, breathless, furious, and burning. This war wasn't over, and they both knew it. Sienna Carter needed air. She sat in her office, palms pressed against her desk, heartbeat hammering in her ears. The scent of Ethan still clung to her skin, or maybe it was just in her head. Damn him, she had spent years building herself back up after he shattered her. And in a single night, a single touch, he had dragged her back into the fire. She needed a distraction. A knock sounded at the door, and for a second her breath caught, but it wasn't him. It was Jordan Blake, her longtime friend and trusted advisor. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jordan observed, stepping inside. Sienna forced a tight smile. "Just a long morning." Jordan studied her, Then, after a beat, "It's him, isn't it?" Sienna's stomach twisted. She didn't answer. Jordan sighed, dropping into the chair across from her. "You know, I never understood what you saw in him. He crushed you, Sienna, and now he's just back?" A deep ache pulsed in her chest, because the truth was he had never really left, not in her mind, not in the way her body still remembered him. Jordan hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "You ever wonder what he was doing after he left you?" Sienna stiffened. Jordan, "Because I do." He slid the phone across her desk, a headline, a picture, a beautiful blonde on Ethan's arm, both of them dripping in wealth and power. Sienna felt ice crawl through her veins. Madeline Royce, the same woman Ethan had discarded her for. Her stomach twisted, sharp and cold. Jordan watched her reaction. "Still think he's changed?" Sienna exhaled slowly. She had been a fool, she had let him back in, and now it was time to remind Ethan Lancaster exactly who the hell he was dealing with. Ethan Lancaster knew she would come. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, whiskey in hand, waiting, watching the city below like a king surveying his empire. But tonight he wasn't thinking about the empire. He was thinking about her, the way she had trembled beneath him, the way she had run, the way she still fought against what they both knew was inevitable. Then, a knock. There she is. Ethan turned just as Sienna Carter stepped inside, her movements sharp, controlled, but her eyes furious. She wasn't here to surrender. She was here to fight. He smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I was wondering how long you'd take." Sienna shut the door behind her, arms crossed. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Ethan let his gaze drag over her, the way her breath hitched, the slight clench of her jaw. She was barely holding it together. He set his glass down. "Tell me what's really bothering you, sweetheart. The fact that you came back to me, or the fact that you liked it?" A flicker of something dark flashed in her eyes. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until there was barely a breath of space between them. "I saw the pictures," she murmured. Ethan frowned. "What pictures?" Sienna let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't play dumb, Lancaster. You and Madeline Royce." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That was years ago." Sienna's eyes gleamed, full of fire and something else. "That's funny, because the press made it look very recent." Ethan exhaled sharply. This wasn't about Madeline, this was about them. He reached out, gripping her wrist before she could pull away. "You're looking for a reason to run, Sienna. But we both know the truth." She stiffened. "And what's that?" Ethan pulled her closer, their bodies brushing. His voice dropped to a murmur. "You don't want to leave." The silence that followed was thick, heated, a game of control neither of them wanted to lose. Sienna's breath faltered. For a single second she hesitated, and that was all he needed. In one swift move, Ethan crushed his mouth against hers. The kiss was raw, brutal, desperate. Like every damn second apart had been torture. Sienna fought him at first, but when his hands curled into her hair, his body pressing her against the wall, she shattered. A whimper escaped her lips, and he swallowed it, deepening the kiss until she had no choice but to melt against him. This was always how it ended, with her in his arms, with him refusing to let go. Sienna pulled back, breathless, her pupils blown wide. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. She didn't speak. She just stared at him, like she was trying to decide if she should hate him or love him. Ethan knew which one he wanted, and this time he wasn't letting her go without a fight. Sienna Carter had spent years believing she had moved on, that she had rewritten herself into a woman who no longer cared for Ethan Lancaster. Then, why was she standing here, pressed against his body, heart pounding like a war drum? Ethan's hands were still on her waist, his breath uneven against her lips, the kiss they had just shared leaving the air between them scorching. But this wasn't like before. This wasn't just lust. It was anger, longing, resentment, craving. It was everything. Ethan's grip on her tightened, his voice rough, raw. "Tell me to let you go, Sienna. Say it and I will." His words sent a sharp pang through her chest. A test, a challenge. but she couldn't. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't know if she could. Sienna sucked in a breath, pressing her palms against his chest. This doesn't change anything, Ethan. His jaw ticked. Then what does? Silence. Heavy. Loaded. She searched his face, looking for the man she once loved, looking for a sign that this wasn't just another game to him. Why now? Her voice cracked despite herself. Why fight for me now, after all these years? Ethan exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair. Because I was a fool, he admitted, his voice lower now, almost vulnerable. I thought I had everything, power, money, success, but none of it meant a damn thing without you. The confession hit her harder than she expected. He had always been smooth, always known the right thing to say, but this felt real. Sienna felt herself unraveling. She turned away, shaking her head. Ethan, I don't know if I can trust you. Ethan moved fast, too fast. In a single motion, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her back against him. His fingers slid beneath her chin, forcing her to look at him. Then let me prove it. His lips brushed hers again, but this time there was no rush, no desperation, just pure, aching need. She felt it, his fear of losing her, the depth of what he was offering. And God help her, she wanted to believe him. Sienna pulled back just enough to whisper, "Then prove it, Ethan." A slow, victorious smirk curved his lips. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, sliding his hands down her body, pulling her close until there was nothing between them. "I intend to." And just like that, the game was over, but this time they were both winning. The city skyline stretched before them, golden light spilling through the massive windows of Ethan Lancaster's penthouse. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at her. Sienna Carter stood by the balcony, her silk robe barely tied, the early morning sun kissing the exposed skin of her collarbone. His shirt was draped over her shoulders, his mark on her, and for once, she didn't seem in a rush to leave. No running, no games, just them. Ethan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "So are you going to admit it now?" Sienna didn't turn. "Admit what?" His smirk deepened. "That you never stopped wanting me." Sienna's lips curved, slow and knowing. She finally faced him, stepping toward him with the same lethal grace that had once ruined him. "Maybe," she murmured, stopping just inches away. "Or maybe you were the one who never stopped wanting me." Ethan reached for her, fingers tracing down her bare arm, watching the way her breath hitched. "I never denied that." His voice was low, rough. "I never will." Their past had been built on power struggles and broken trust. But now there was something else, something real. Sienna studied him for a long moment. Then with a slow, wicked smile, she slipped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." Ethan crushed his mouth against hers, sealing the promise between them. No more games, no more doubts. This time they were all in. Love and power. Two forces that rarely coexist peacefully. For years, Ethan and Sienna fought against each other, both too stubborn, too proud to admit what truly mattered. They believed they had to win in order to be happy. But love isn't about winning, it's about choosing. Choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to let go of the past, choosing to believe that some things are worth more than power, more than pride. Sienna thought she had built herself into a woman immune to Ethan Lancaster. Ethan thought he had constructed a life where he didn't need her. They were both wrong, because at the end of the day, what is success without someone to share it with? What is power if it leaves you empty? Now tell me, have you ever walked away from something convinced it was the right choice, only to wonder later, what if? Would you risk your pride for a second chance? Or would you let love slip away? Afraid to lose control? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear your stories.